Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week, we feature interviews with incredible poets and artists, including Olivia Gatwood and A.E. Stallings, and original poetry read by the authors. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas and Portraits of Red and Gray. Yanyi is the author of Dream of the Divided Field, One World 2022, and The Year of Blue Water, Yale University Press 2019, winner of the 2018 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize. His work has been featured in or at NPR's All Things Considered, New York Public Library, Tin House, Granta, and A Public Space, and he is the recipient of fellowships from Asian American Writers Workshop and Poets House. He holds an MFA in poetry from New York University. He was most recently poetry editor at Foundry. Currently, he teaches creative writing at large and gives creative advice at The Reading. Yanyi, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, James.
I'm really excited to discuss Dream of the Divided Field, such a wonderful book. What is it that you love about poetry before we get into the book itself? And what first attracted you to expressing your ideas through poetic forms?
Ooh, the big questions at the beginning. I feel like I feel like I remember different things every time I answer this question. The thing that comes up for me right now is a discussion I had with a friend of mine, a poet named Kate Walsh, who was saying to me, poets are people who want to be right about things, but the kind of right is not about winning. It's about getting closer to whatever is true. Mm-hmm. And I think I've always been just interested in that as a person. I've always wanted to know kind of at a deeper level of like, what does this thing in the world signify, or what is this telling me about how I should live my life, so I can, in a way, get the most maximal, not value. I guess it sounds so economic, but it's a kind of way of life for me, I think. And the writing is just something that I happen to do to get to that kind of understanding.
So I love the variety of forms and voices you've employed in Dream of the Divided Field. Poems that are slight and sparse like Blackout, and longer prose poems such as the pair of Home for the Holidays poems. How do you find the form that captures the idea or image that you want to share?
Well, a lot of my poems start out kind of just... you have a spark or a moment, a flash of something. A lot of times for me, it's musical. Mm-hmm. So Blackout, for example, happened during an actual blackout. I was in New Mexico with a friend, and we were staying in one of those Earth ships in Taos, and the electricity went out, and I woke up in the middle of the night and all of the lights were on, and it was kind of in that moment where I ended up just writing quickly something like on my phone. And all of my poems start out most of the time in some kind of prose. Mm-hmm. I can tell pretty quickly, rhythmically, and with the kinds of rhymes that show up when I'm writing the poem, that whether or not the poem wants to turn into a form. But I try so hard not to impose anything at the beginning, and I try to let the poem and try to let myself think in as fully as I can before I whittle it down to whatever it is that it ends up becoming. So Home for the Holidays was written and Blackout were both written kind of in the same ways, but they ended up, because of the ways that they came out, in completely different forms. I have a strong editor or critical person or voice. So for me, it's like, no, shh, be quiet. And let the actual writer do the writing first.
No, it's interesting you say that. That's definitely similar to the way I approach it. And it's partially because I tend to write very late at night on my phone in dark mode so that I don't wake my wife up. But I'll pick up my phone and go into Google Docs in dark mode so it doesn't cast much light. And I'll just start writing. Because it's on my phone, I really can't focus too much on form. It's just not practical. So I just focus
No.
on the words and images. Then there are other poets like Carmine DiBiase and A.E. Stallings, who I interviewed on the series, who they have a way of seeing the form first, or they use the form as a constraint or a decision made that they don't have to think about later, and then pour the poem into it, and that's like a mold, and that's definitely so the way you approach it is definitely more similar to the way I do, and I think most of the folks I talk to. So the poems in this collection about transitioning achieve an extraordinary balance of setting just enough context without being so concrete that the poetry is lost. Taking Care is a powerful example of that. What's your approach to achieving that balance of providing the context but not being so, documentary in nature that the poetry gets lost along the way?
This is a really interesting problem, or an interesting kind of issue that comes up still for me. And I notice it when I'm teaching too, that I have students who are kind of explainers. And so there's a two-pronged kind of way that I think about it. The first of which is you have to have the courage to like not ask someone to understand you, or to really believe that you can be understood. I think there's an emotional courage that needs to be there in order to get to the kind of editing that you want to do, possibly. So for me, I, as you know, will write as fully as I can. I will include everything that I think, etc., for the first couple of drafts that I write. And there's a lot of kind of push and pull of like, I write a little and then I edit and then I write a little, which you probably know about. But after a certain point, my editing style is if I think a lot in terms of image. So if the question for me becomes, does this image tell me just as much as what this kind of more abstract detail tells us? And if that's the case, then I can probably cut the more explainy part of it. Or there are aspects of editing around not wanting to share certain details of my life and having to ask like, well, do I lie here and add something different, or do I just cut it? So that's a little bit of the kind of thinking tree that happens when I'm editing stuff.
It's so tricky because if you're too abstract and too ambiguous, then the reader can get caught up and distracted by trying to figure out what the heck's going on. But if you're too explicit, then you don't give any chance for that poem to have different meanings. And I think a nice example of that is, when I read and reread Coming Over from Dream of the Dividing Field, which you'll read later in the interview, it can be interpreted as referring to a separation of two people as a standalone poem. But in the context of your book, the poem takes on a completely different meaning. So what was your approach to revising and editing the manuscript to achieve poems that both work individually but that serve the book as a whole?
I'm so glad that you saw that about Coming Over. Once I understood the book as a book, I learned about Coming Over as like more than just a breakup poem. It is a poem about integration of the self and also disintegration. And it was a really difficult process this time around because stylistically the poems in this book are very, very different from each other. And so I had to kind of like ask myself about the balance of like what should it feel like going through the book formally, but also conceptually how much information I want to give to people. But a lot of the ways that I ended up thinking about it is I actually had to go through every single poem and write down, here what are the themes that this is touching on, and like what more is really coming out of this book than just what I kind of like my preconception of it, which is like, oh, it's a breakup book, but it's really not. Oh, I mean, it is, but it's so much more than a breakup book. It's about this kind of larger question of how does one retain or have a self between two moments in time, and is it possible for that same person to exist? And there's et cetera, more ways that you can use that as a metaphor for other things.
And I think what was that, and that's why I read, when I do these interviews, I read each book twice, and I try to read the first time knowing as little as possible, so that I just experience it fresh. And when I reread the book, I just saw that poem in particular in two very distinct ways. It was very cool. I really enjoyed that. So I definitely encourage listeners, if you have the time, read books of poetry twice, because you will see poems a different way the second time through, and it's almost as though you're reading a brand new version of it. So in Landscape with 100 Turns, you write, 100 birds flew over 100 fields. A mountain flowed into 100 rivers, then ended. In 100 rooms I turned and turned, hoping to return to you. Such a beautiful passage. It jumped out the page at me. How do you know when you've created something beautiful versus knowing you need to revise, edit, or even rewrite entirely? And what are the feedback loops that help you find those points where you should not touch it and where you should work at it?
Ooh, okay. So just let me know if I forget to answer any part of this question, because I feel like there's a lot there. I feel like I've already forgotten the question.
I think it's like you've written something beautiful. I mean, it's like, how do you know this was a beautiful thing, and you just shouldn't overwork it? It's like dough that is ready to be cooked, and you don't need to overwork it. Versus, targeting, knowing that I really need to work at this. It's not there. And how do it's almost hard to assess yourself. Like, what are your feedback loops that help you target that editing process?
Well, time is definitely a big factor for me. I like to, I do a lot of things kind of in my editorial process to re-meet the poem. And it's evolved kind of. For this book, it was one way, and for whatever I'm writing now, it's a different thing. But I do a lot of handwriting and retyping, and part of that process is this particular part worth my typing this out again or writing this out again? Do I derive pleasure from writing this out again? So that's a very practical thing. But the rest is really like, I remember writing Landscape with 100 Turns. It was part of this, I was doing morning pages at the time, and it was part of this like blob of stuff. It's like 6 pages that I was of kind of figuring out or moving through that metaphor and what I was trying to understand with it. And when I reread it, when I was typing it up, I was like, oh, I don't have this. At least half this stuff, I'm not gonna. It's kind of contrived or whatever. So part of it is also kind of my editorial eye and my experience of approaching writing as a reader and knowing like, this is what I want to read or this is what I don't want to read. And it's so much more than like what is beautiful or what is not beautiful. It is about kind of, for me, about newness of experience and newness of understanding. And the poem, as I think Thomas Tranströmer calls it, the poem is a railing that you hold on to as you're going into the dark of understanding or something like that. But that is kind of how I think about it, of like, how can this metaphor continue to help me? I want to feel excited whenever I read my own work again, even if I've read it 100 times. Speaking of 100
yes, yeah.
turns.
No, I definitely think your point about time's important. If you step away from something, you're going to get closer to experiencing it as a reader and less as the poet who just spent time to write something down. Part of it too is you have to not get attached to the time you invested in something, because the time you invest in it doesn't necessarily correlate to how good it is, and probably doesn't correlate at all. So
definitely not. Yeah.
I think the other thing that I like to do too is to, which Olivia Gatt would really reinforce when I spoke to her, is just read it out loud is so important. And I used to do that, but I didn't do it as intentionally is after talking to her, where that you have to try to hear it as it would be performed. And then, yeah, if you enjoy reading it, is a similar thing. If you enjoy reading it out loud, that's a good sign. If you don't enjoy reading it out loud, or you're sort of skipping over something, that's a flag too. So, but I do think in that particular case, that was both served the poem and it was just beautifully written. So when finalizing the manuscripts of my books, I agonize over which poems to include, which need more work, how to order the poems, how to group them into sections, what to call the sections, all these things. How did you approach selecting poems for this collection and then finding the way to group and order them?
It was a really arduous process for this book. I would say that my first book was a lot more intuitive, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that that first book is just written in one style, and I also kind of had a clear vision of kind of what I wanted to do, and I had a lot more time. I had like kind of 2 years of like no prospect of it being published to kind of polish it off and really make it into what I wanted. And this book, I really kind of went through a couple of different phases of I had to create different drafts of it in order to understand really what are the possible resonances of this book that I'm not seeing right now. And my editor, Nicole Counts, was really helpful in helping bring those to my attention. And I do feel as though having another reader or an editor is kind of a shortcut to that time thing, because you have another person who's like, but have you looked at this or seen this? So I did that kind of like categorization thing that I told you about earlier, and then I do this thing that I call DJing by feelings, where I read kind of one poem at a time, and I ask myself, what do I feel like reading? But in the case of this book, I also had to think about what kind of explicitly do I want to share with the reader? What information do they need in order to successfully navigate this book, which is more abstract and a little more kind of like you kind of have to read a little bit more deeply into things in order to kind of get the full experience. So yeah, that was a really challenging aspect of it, I would say.
Yeah, no, I definitely, I've done the whole print out everything, put it on my family room floor, leave it there for a couple weeks, walk by it, think about it, move stuff around, remove things, add things, decide there's a hole to fill. And yes, I found that it's incredible how there's no manual that says how to do any of these things, but so many poets I've talked to, they do something similar. So the poem Dream in Which I Try to Disappear in Front of My Aunt, or Interrogation, is a powerful example of a recurring theme of separation from family, of the challenges of acceptance, of dislocation. You write, "She's coming over and I know she will tell my mother everything. So I retreat from the rooms I know she'll be in. I reverse time. My low voice and short hair return to drawers and dark corners." It's difficult, if not impossible, as a poet to write without including very intimate and personal details of self, of trauma, of family, of relationships. And you touched on this a little bit before, but how do you approach deciding which personal details to include and which to edit out without sacrificing the poetry when doing so? Because I'm sure there are times when there's something very personal that you know would serve the poem, but and I've had that struggle where I'm not sure I was bullied a lot in middle school before getting to 6'5", turned that bullying threat off. But I finally found a way to write about that, but it was very difficult, and it was, it resurfaced things that at the time were really painful. So how do you make that call on what to share and what not to share?
I always think about a couple of different things. The first thing that I think about is like the kind of question of, is this thing that I'm sharing possibly useful for another person to know? Like as a kind of like collective moment of being able to like, this has happened to me and therefore maybe has happened to you, and that being helpful. Another thing that I do have a bit of an ethical guideline thing that I follow now. If I name people by name, I will ask them if I can use their names. I send them a copy of the poem. With family, it's a little more complicated because of kind of my history with my family, and also just how important that is to like my experience as a person, and therefore my poetics. So some ways that I get around it include actually just writing about dreams and allowing those details to be a bit abstracted. Like the like it. This is the poem that you just mentioned is a dream that happens to me, but it's abstracted in a way where I can really get to just talking about the thing that I'm more interested in, which is like not being able to go back in time and the kind of uh, my version of being chased by monsters dream, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, that feeling of wanting to let someone in, and but that fear of them getting too close, basically, into too intimate parts, which is a funny way of thinking about the question you just asked.
Yeah. Well, and I think that for the poets listening who are thinking about writing about something that was traumatic, was mugged in Boston and wrote a poem about that in my first book and had to relive it very vividly to make the poem work. And I had sort of not thought about it in a while, but I found it very helpful to get it out. And then
Yeah.
and this is something I've definitely talking to other poets they've experienced too. Once you get it out and you start thinking of it as a poem, it becomes one step removed, and it becomes more, you're focused on the poetry, and this memory, it doesn't go away. It's not forgotten, but
Yeah.
it's almost, it's just externalizing it is helpful. So just for listeners that have traumatic experiences, writing it down, even if it doesn't turn into a great poem that you're going to go publish somewhere, it can be very therapeutic. So I'm fascinated by very short poems. That is not my strength. I actually work with a poetry coach who one week said, okay, for next time we meet, you're going to write a whole bunch of micro poems, and they're going to have no more than X number of syllables. And it was a very helpful exercise. So Migrants from your book is an example, just slightly longer than a haiku. My poems tend to be longer, and using migrants as an example, what is your thought process when writing a poem that only needs a few lines to capture an idea? Does it kind of start as that really tiny, slight poem, or is it a longer poem that you realize when you're cutting things out, it really doesn't need to be longer?
I'm trying to think of all of the instances in this book in particular where the poems are short and like what the story is behind them. Migrants was a poem that I think it started out as a longer poem. It was a page-length poem, and I kept trying to revise the whole poem, and or I kept trying to add to it, and it was just not working. And I was like, why is this not working? And then I realized but I kept that particular part of the poem coherent every single time I did a draft, and I realized that was the only thing I wanted to say. And it's always very liberating to realize that, of like, you might think that a poem should have a certain length or sound or whatever, but the poem will always rear its head in whatever way it wants to be. So yeah, I just cut the rest of everything that was not necessary in that poem, and the whole poem is that turn, and that's it. Another poem in the collection, towards the end, I had a vision of a hill, I think, is a poem that I wrote kind of in one stroke, and was, again, like, I was like, one day I'm going to add more to this, and it'll say more, and the whole point of the poem was that it is just what it is. But that one, I didn't cut anything. It just kind of came out that way, and I was wise enough this time around not to
try to make it more than it needed to be.
Yeah.
No, I'm so glad I asked about migrants, because I think that's an important skill that you have to acquire over as you write more and more poetry, is the willingness to cut stuff out, and even after you spent time writing it. And I know I've found now, having done that enough times, that consistently when I decide I'm going to edit something out, at the time there's a little pang of, I spent so much time writing that, but then minutes later I can't even remember what I wrote. Like
Yeah.
it's just gone. Like and that is just evidence that it didn't need to be there. So I'm that's so cool that you took a page length poem and it became so exactly what it needed to be. So one more question before I hand the mic over to you. So Billy Collins said at a reading I attended recently in response to an audience question that a key to writing poetry is reading poetry by poets that make you jealous. So what poets do you read that make you jealous, that challenge you to expand your voice?
Ooh, who am I thinking about right now? I feel as though at the moment, um, I'm kind of in this place where I'm interested in expanding my voice to be longer. I'm working on a long poem right now, and it's just such a different, because I'm usually like maybe a page, page and a half, or 3 lines. And so I'm really learning kind of a new way of being with a poem. I feel like this is kind of old school, but I'll always be jealous of Virginia Woolf, um, and the way that she pulled things together. Um, I think in particular, any poet who really writes in tight, formal verse. Philip Williams just came out with a book last year, Mutinying, that is really really well composed, constructed. Roger Reeves also comes to mind, of someone who's got something really in the medium to long length line that I really admire. And I think I'll always say Linda Gregg, because I'm working on her work as well. Yeah, I think those are the people who I'm thinking about for now.
Yeah, and then and the reason I ask this is for the poets listening. There's reading poetry. Well, reading in general is the best way to write well. It's hard to write well if you don't read well. And doing this podcast has given me the extraordinary opportunity to talk to so many wonderful poets. And after I interviewed A.E. Stallings, I was so jealous in a good way. That I don't want jealous to be misinterpreted as negative. About her ability to incorporate these extraordinary perfect words that are definitely long tail words, but they're not obscure in the sense that they're dead words. They're just the perfect word that isn't used very often. And then her use of received forms is just extraordinary. So, and I'm more of a free verse by default, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write some received forms, and I'm going to try to get closer to what she's accomplished. And it was good. I generated some poems that I'm very, very proud of that I likely would not have, that I ended up sharing a couple with her, and she gave me a couple really helpful notes. And I wouldn't have written them had I not been challenged by her. So it's so definitely reading Migrants makes me think I've got to find a way to write some really short poems that are just enough. That's definitely not in my wheelhouse. That's definitely planted that seed. Well, now I'm going to turn the mic over to you to read selections from Dream of the Divided Field.
Coming over. What was left of our relationship neatly folded on the couch, and the bathroom noticed what else was missing. You came into the bathroom taking out your razor, your toothbrush, leaving my toothbrush, replacing everything next to its double, as though I had needlessly doubled. I walked out from my bathroom and you walked into my bathroom. The little soap and the razor, the duplicates in the bags not wanting to owe me anything, not wanting to have appeared. It is like that. I give my house and you take how you live in it. Not backwards or forwards, but the past and the present overcoming one another. Family tree. I was born on October 1st, 1980, in Guangzhou, China. My mother walked herself to the hospital. She said she found me in a basket. I was born on October 2nd, 1990, in Nanjing, China. My father was not there for my birth. My father waited for me to be born but left when I didn't come out. My mother has a long scar from where I, or they, cut her. I was born a girl and I was born a boy. I was born on October 3rd in the 70s in the fourth largest city of my parents' province. My father stayed for my birth, but I didn't show up. When I did, my mother still has a scar. I left on a plane when I was 4.5, saw my father for the first time when we landed. When I grew up, I forgot his birthday. He told me he made up the date of his birthday, so I don't know whether I forgot the lie or the real thing. I was born as my father, who died in the womb. I was born on October 4th, 1990, in Shanghai, China, the only child of my parents. My parents met in silence. I imagined them laughing. Rarely did they laugh together in memory, but this doesn't mean it didn't happen. I was born on October 5th in the 80s, in the second largest city of my parents' province. My mother was 27, only a month apart from my father. Later, we moved to Canada. My mother worked in the back of a Chili's to learn English. My father learned English by eating the nightly mozzarella sticks. We cooked cats with neighbors and friends. I kept jars and jars of grasshoppers. My parents grew more than a month apart. My father named me for a bird, then disappeared into migration. Garden sketch. On the left-hand corner is the bottom mound, surrounded by dense shrubbery. Over the mound to the right is the beginning of the land, which stretches further than itself in an ecstatic flailing. The land is cornered by only what is necessary, its bare back. It goes on and on to the middle, which only what we have been able to recreate here in this space. Peel the corners, there is laughing, but no people. The sun appears in the lower right corner while its gaze goes on dotting to the moon, surely rising, top right. In the middle of the land is a lake, and then in its middle, a man. That is me. I look back at you.
Wonderful. So I'm given the subject matter of the book of transitioning in part and many other themes that are woven in. These are experiences in many cases that are very different from my own as a cis Caucasian male. And I learned things about that experience through your poetry. What have you learned from the readers of your poetry and the way that they provide feedback and may have had similar experiences or not had that experiences and had a deeper understanding through your writing?
I can give you just some recent examples from just the book being out in the world. I have a former mentor and teacher of mine who experienced breast cancer, who reached out to me and was very moved by the Home for the Holidays poems. And that was, I obviously I was thinking about my own experience when I wrote those poems, but I never thought about it in terms of like someone who had the same surgery for different reasons,
right?
How they might have connected with the poem. So I think that's always like really gratifying to me of hearing from people whose experiences were not exactly the same or even kind of far away from what I was expecting, relating to the work and finding it really helpful. For my first book too, I wrote about abuse kind of within the family unit, that in a particular context, kind of around queerness. And I had someone write to me over social media where that context was a little bit different, but it still kind of like was moving for them around kind of their relational kind of boundaries with an abusive other. So I always learn from my readers how the book can be interpreted in different ways beyond what I'm thinking about when I'm doing the work. It ranges from people who just kind of discover formal things that I wasn't thinking about when I was putting the book together, but I think the things that I always remember, as you can tell from my examples, are when the work is useful for people whose experiences are just unlike mine. And yeah, I kind of, you kind of always think of like, oh, like people are coming here to learn about like, I don't know, these XYZ subjects or whatever. And the possibilities of a book range so much further than that, than information gathering. Something multiplies when you read and interpret together.
Yeah, no, I had a similar experience with a poem I wrote for my first book that was it was inspired by a bell buoy out in the Pacific Ocean that I saw walking along the shore with my wife, and I thought, what would it be like to be tethered to the ocean floor with this important job, but really cut off from any contact? And then I built a whole poem around that called Tethered. And then I
Mm-hmm.
shared it with some friends, and another friend said, "Oh, I interpreted that as like my parents who are in their 90s and they're tethered to their home, but the world revolves around them, and they know every squirrel and every dog that passes, and when the mail is delivered,
Mm-hmm.
and their whole world is encapsulated because of they're so elderly they can't really get out and walk around, but they're tethered to that home." And then an animator I worked with to turn that poem into an animated film viewed it as being tethered to her apartment in Italy during the pandemic. And yeah, and I think your point, that call out of, I've had on, several close friends who have gone through breast cancer, and yes, that example that you called, I had the same reaction where, oh, that's the detail that happens behind, in a hospital or behind closed doors when people are recovering, that they don't talk about as much. And I thought it was very helpful. So I think that's where you were actually more explicit. And I thought you made a really good choice
Mm-hmm.
there to provide more detail and some specific language that I had heard and could appreciate better. So it's very effective. Well, just one more question. I
Mm-hmm.
reread Family Tree multiple times. It's such a wonderful use of the prose poetry form, which you mentioned in other contexts. So full sentences, paragraphs, it's prose, and yet it works because it isn't really prose, it's poetry. And I think that's the cool thing about prose poetry, which I've incorporated into a few poems. And for me, it's the sparseness of language, the jumps in time. So how did this poem specifically evolve from the initial idea, from the first phrases, into this very tight, prosaic but clearly poetic work?
Well, the poem was inspired from a workshop when during my MFA. The poet Wo Chan, who was a fellow student at the time, brought in this prose piece, I think, by Luc Sant called "Resume," and it is kind of a very similar of like a biographical sketch of one's life, but every single biography is different. And so it is this beautiful kind of like permission to lie prompt, which I often use when I teach too, actually. And so for me, it was like, well, what am I going to lie about and why? And that became in its own way kind of an exploration of like, what am I trying to hide, or what do I hide for what reasons? So so there were, like, for example, more explicit or truthful, if you will, or like grandiose kind of versions of the stanzas that were kind of taken out at a different point. And during the editorial process, I kind of just realized that I wanted to kind of circle around this image of kind of migration and what does it mean to be conceptualized by one's parents, and how does one conceptualize one's parents based on this kind of shared origin story in a way. And yeah, so it kind of just evolved from that. I noticed also, like, I think, to speak to your point about like prose poetry being like it's in prose, but what about it kind of makes it poetry? Obviously, the repetition in every single stanza about "I was born, I was born, I was born," but I think there also was for me kind of the play and moving around kind of the same phrases or the same ideas, but just slightly changing them, that I think give the poem kind of its heft in the idea of the conception, kind of, or the ideas happening in kind of the differences between every single one.
Cool. Well, last question is, what are you working on now that has you excited? And you've sort of hinted at a little bit earlier.
Well, I very explicitly told myself that I'm going to take as long as I want to write the next thing that I'm going to put out into the world. I wrote my first two books basically in like very quick succession after each other. Not because that was my intention, but I kind of it just kind of happened that way. And I really want space to like grow into new versions of my voice. So I'm working on a very long poem right now, and that is at the moment kind of about it's like about New York and leaving New York, but and being there for 10 years. So it's funny that you're there right now.
Yeah.
And kind of what I wanted and what I hoped for. And it's a little bit of like a Künstlerroman, if one were to think about it in terms of, like what is the plot. But yeah, I'm using it to kind of explore a lot more things, especially around kind of like paradise, basically, and like where is it now in our world. And how are we searching for it, and stuff like that. So yeah, it's that and a bunch of nature poems. I'm like writing a lot about nature.
Cool.
So it's very strange. I feel like I know exactly what the book is going to be, but I also have no idea what it's like, very in detail going to look like or be. But one of the strange things that's happening is that as I'm writing this, I feel like I know the superstructure of kind of what the manuscript will look like or will be, but it's like when you're going on a hike or like a 9-day hike and you're like, oh, those mountains over there, I'll be over them by the end of this, but not right now.
Well, I can't wait to read what you have coming next, and I'll patiently wait for it as you give it the time that it deserves. And yes, time is the most powerful editor with poetry. It really is.
It really is.
So Thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Twitter at Dublin Ranch, subscribe to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and follow us on viewlesswings.com or on Instagram at viewlesswings.